Hello, my name is Margaret Pierce. I'm 78 years old, and 2 weeks ago, my son slapped me so hard I hit the kitchen floor bleeding. Why? Because his wife screamed at me to pay rent or get out in the very house I helped them buy. I raised that boy. I cooked every meal in that kitchen. And yet suddenly, I was just an old woman overstaying her welcome. But I didn't stay silent. Because when they opened that will, they realized I wasn't just someone's mother. I was still his wife. This is the story of how I was erased and how I quietly came back. You can pour the tea, but don't expect anyone to sit and drink it with you. The fluorescent light buzzed softly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the empty kitchen. Maggie stood by the counter, her hand gently resting on the edge of a wooden cutting board, worn smooth with years of use. Not here, not in this house, but in another kitchen, in another lifetime. Outside the window, the trees in the yard stood bare. The garden, Charles once tended so carefully, was now nothing but brittle stems and earth choked by frost. It was the last Saturday of December, 2 weeks since the funeral, and today should have felt like a day for family. Laughter, shared pie. Instead, silence crept through the hallways like a draught. She stirred the pot gently. The aroma of butternut squash soup, Charles's favourite, curled into the air. She'd started cooking early, just as he used to do before guests arrived. Old habits didn't seem to vanish when the person they belonged to did. At 5 o'clock, she laid out the table. Bowls, napkins, even a dish of warm rolls wrapped in a kitchen towel. She folded them the way her mother had taught her, corners, tucked seams, hidden. A small detail, maybe, but one that used to matter. Down the hall, a door opened. Footsteps. Maggie's face lit up for a moment. Teresa appeared, holding her phone and speaking into it, her voice low but clipped. She paused as she entered the kitchen, then looked at the table. "Oh, Maggie," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "You really didn't have to. Brian and I already ordered Thai. It'll be here in 20. Maggie blinked. "I made the soup Charles always liked for Thanksgiving." Teresa offered a polite smile, the kind given to strangers in waiting rooms. "That's sweet of you. Maybe tomorrow." "Tomorrow." Maggie looked at the soup still steaming in the pot. She gave a small nod. "Sure. Tomorrow." Teresa was already walking out again, murmuring back into her phone. Maggie heard the words "elder care site" float by before the door clicked shut. Left alone, she returned to the counter and turned off the stove. The kitchen was wide and modern, all stainless steel and granite, clean lines and surfaces without dust or warmth. She retrieved a cup from the cabinet and poured herself tea. No sugar. No milk. She used to joke that Charles took his tea like he took his weatherplane, predictable, a little bitter, if left too long. She sat down, hands wrapped around the cup, her eyes drifting to the chair across from her. No one had ever officially claimed it, but it had been Charles's by use, by presence. Now it sat like an empty coat, a shape that reminded, but no longer held anything. In the distance, Brian's voice echoed faintly from upstairs. Something about stocks, maybe football. She couldn't quite tell. She used to recognize every inflection in her son's voice. Now even that felt distant, like tuning into a station just slightly off frequency. After a while, her tea grew cold. She picked up the remote, hesitated. "Would it be all right if I turned this on?" She called softly, not knowing if anyone would hear or care. There was no answer. Upstairs, a door closed. That night, Maggie retreated to her room earlier than usual. Her footsteps were careful, avoiding the creaky part of the stairs out of instinct. The hallway light flickered overhead as she opened her door and stepped inside. Something felt wrong. She noticed it immediately. The drawer of her nightstand was slightly ajar. She always closed it, always. Maggie approached her breath, hitching. Inside her, things had been disturbed. Her reading glasses were askew. A sachet of lavender from Lisa was crumpled, and on top of a small stack of yellowed postcards sat a letter unfolded. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was familiar, Charles's looping script, steady even in the last months. But the envelope was torn. Someone had read it. She didn't know who had opened the letter until later that night. There was the sound of a knife scraping a plate. Other than that, no one spoke. The overhead light flickered, once then settled into a steady glow, too bright, too white. Maggie sat at the far end of the dining table, her posture, neat hands, resting in her lap as she waited for someone to say something. Anything. The table had been set, just as she always did. Forks on the left, knives on the right, napkins folded in quiet triangles. The smell of steamed vegetables and roasted chicken lingered faintly, but no one commented on it. Teresa sat across from her, poking at her food. Brian scrolled on his phone, the blue glow lighting up his tired face. It was a cold Monday night. Outside, the wind whistled against the windows, tugging at the last dead leaves on the maple tree. Inside, the silence was thicker than soup. The television was off. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum more quietly than usual, as if respecting the mood. Earlier that day, Teresa had cleared her throat as Maggie was peeling carrots. Just to help things run smoothly, she began, "I've made a little kitchen schedule. It's posted on the fridge." Maggie glanced over. A neat chart drawn in bright marker. Breakfast, 6:30, 8:00. Prep time, 4:00, 5:00. Shared kitchen use, max 1 hour per person. It looked like something from a college dorm. Or a facility, not a home. "Oh," Maggie had said, simply nodding. Now at the table, she served the food quietly as she always did. No one offered to help. When she placed a bowl of her slow-cooked greens near Teresa, the younger woman gave a tight smile and gently nudged the bowl to the side. "Lisa doesn't like these much," Teresa murmured. "She's not here." Maggie replied softly before she could stop herself. Brian cleared his throat. "Mum, you really don't have to go through all this trouble. We could have just had leftovers." Maggie didn't answer. She just kept serving the motion more automatic than intentional now. The only sounds were utensils clinking lightly against porcelain, the tap of Brian's thumb on his screen. No one asked how her day was. No one mentioned Charles. No one asked if she was sleeping all right. Maggie suddenly became aware that she hadn't spoken more than 2 full sentences all day. Trying to cut through the stillness, she said, "Will Lisa be coming by this weekend?" Teresa didn't look up. "She's busy." A silence fell again, sharper now. Maggie looked at her plate, still full. The food didn't taste like much anymore. She used to cook with music playing, Charles humming nearby, Lisa reaching over for a spoonful before it was done. Now she felt like an echo. She looked at her son, but his eyes were glued to the screen. She looked at Teresa, who kept her focus on the untouched salad. Not once did anyone ask her how she was, not even out of politeness. She was a shape at the table, present, but not part of the conversation. She wasn't even sure there had been a conversation. After dinner, Maggie offered to do the dishes. Teresa didn't protest. Of course not. Maggie cleaned silently the water, warming her hands, even as the rest of her body felt cold. The soap smelled like lemon, but artificial, nothing like the fresh citrus she used to zest for cakes in her own kitchen. She reached for her porcelain mug, the one with blue hydrangeas painted along the rim, a gift from Lisa 2 birthdays ago. It was hers, the one thing she'd brought with her from her old house that she used every day. Her hand stopped mid-air. There along the side was a long hairline crack. Not from age, no, she would have noticed. This looked new. A split, creeping downward like a fault line. The kind that came from a sudden knock or being dropped, then set carefully back to look untouched. Her chest tightened. She rinsed it, slowly, carefully. Her fingers traced the fracture. She didn't say a word, but that night she wrapped the mug in a towel before putting it away. You don't live here for free. Or did you think we were going to support you forever? The clink of dishes filled the kitchen, punctuated only by the steady hiss of water from the tap. Maggie stood at the sink, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, rinsing each plate with care. It was a quiet morning just after 9, the pale Wednesday sun slanting across the tiled floor in long, cold lines. The kitchen door had been left ajar. Outside, wind rustled the porch awning, nudging dry leaves across the steps. Inside, Maggie could hear them, Teresa and Brian, speaking low in the hallway. She hadn't meant to overhear, but their voices carried. "She's using water like this is a hotel," Teresa said, her tone sharp but subdued. "She's not doing it on purpose," Brian murmured, more hesitant. There was a pause. Then Teresa again. "I'm just saying utilities aren't free, Brian. Groceries either. She doesn't contribute. Not a dime. We're not a charity." "I'll talk to her," Brian replied, barely above a whisper. Maggie stopped drying the plate in her hand. Her knuckles whitened against the towel. She waited, not breathing, not blinking. Moments later, they entered the kitchen. Brian's eyes avoided hers. Teresa, as usual, was brisk and composed, holding a steaming cup of coffee like a prop. Maggie, Teresa said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "We've been meaning to talk to you." Maggie turned, slowly drying her hands. "Yes, it's about expenses. Since you're living here now, we thought it'd be fair to discuss rent." Teresa's voice was even rehearsed. Brian said nothing. Maggie blinked. "I see. I mean, if you're not able to contribute." Teresa continued, "We understand. But then perhaps it's time to think about alternative arrangements. Something more suited to your needs." Something shifted in Maggie's chest, not anger, not yet. Just the sting of realization. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. It was about place, about how she no longer had one. "I have some savings," she said quietly. "Enough to help." Brian finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "So you've been hiding money this whole time, living off us while you sat on it, no?" Maggie began. He stepped forward, voice rising. "Is that what this is? You just sit around cooking old recipes, wasting water and electricity, and we're the ones footing the bill." I didn't mean she tried, but her voice was too soft. His hand came down before either of them knew it. A sharp sound, skin meeting skin, filled the air. Maggie staggered backward. Her foot caught on the edge of the rug, and she fell hard, her shoulder hitting the corner of the counter on the way down. The side of her face struck the floor. Something cracked, not a bone perhaps, but something older, more fragile. Blood began to bead at her temple, warm and slow. Teresa gasped. Brian froze. Maggie didn't cry out. She didn't move for several seconds, only opened her eyes to the light above, harsh and white, the same light that buzzed over every silent meal. She turned her head, slightly vision swimming. Across the room, the old cupboard stood untouched, the one Charles had insisted on moving into this house when they sold the farm. Its wood was dark, its handle curved like a question mark. Inside, on the top shelf, he had once hidden a music box for her birthday, a gift she never expected, a secret kept just for her. Now it stood in shadow. She lay there staring at the cupboard, not crying, just breathing, while the light poured across her face like an interrogation. You don't need to explain. Those who live long enough understand. The sky was heavy with low grey clouds pressing down on the rooftops like a wet cloth. Flurries of snow drifted sideways, soft as ash, coating the steps in a thin, patchy veil. Maggie sat wrapped in an old cardigan on the front porch, her left temple bandaged hands folded in her lap. She wasn't sure how long she'd been there. The cold crept through the wood beneath her, settling into her bones like it belonged there. Teresa had driven her to the clinic, barely speaking a word along the way. She slipped Teresa had told the nurse with a forced smile. We warned her not to mop the floor without help. No one questioned the bruise. The doctor had dabbed at the gash with a practiced touch and muttered something about age and precautions. Avoid heavy lifting. Rest. Drink fluids. Then home again. No apology, no inquiry. Just instructions to rest and keep out of the way. Now Maggie stared at the garden bed beneath the porch railing, dry twigs, frost-burnt leaves, the last of autumn's colour long gone. Among them, a ceramic planter with a shriveled camellia. It had belonged to Charles. He used to prune it every spring, muttering to it like an old friend. Now, the plant sat dormant, its branches knotted and bare. Maggie exhaled into her hands. The wooden gate creaked open. She turned, startled. Grace stood there, bundled in a long grey coat, wool gloves, clutching something nestled in cloth. Her hair was pinned back in an old-fashioned twist, her expression calm but direct. I thought of you, Grace said, stepping closer, so I brought this. She lifted the cloth to reveal a camellia, younger than the one in Maggie's pot, but wilted from the cold. Its leaves curled its soil dry. Grace set it gently down beside the other pot. This one looked dead last winter, she said, voice low and even. Turns out it was just sleeping. They do that, hide everything inside. Maggie blinked, then nodded slowly. Thank you. Grace sat beside her without asking. Close, but not too close. She didn't ask about the bandage. She didn't ask about the fall. Instead, she unwrapped a small heat pack and slipped it into a soft towel. She placed it carefully on Maggie's wrist. I keep extras, she said simply. Bad joints. The warmth seeped into Maggie's skin. For the first time in days, something felt kind. They sat in silence. The wind danced through the chimes overhead. Somewhere a dog barked once, then quieted. Maggie stared at the camellia. I didn't think anyone heard, she whispered, surprising even herself. Grace didn't look at her. I live right next door. Maggie's throat tightened. I heard voices, Grace continued. Sharp ones. A crash. She paused, then added, if you ever need someone to say what they heard, you can ask me. Maggie looked at her, really looked. In Grace's face, she saw years, joy and loss, resignation and quiet courage. A woman who had weathered seasons without announcement. A reflection of herself, but steadier. She nodded. Grace stood brushing snow from her coat. I'll come by next week. Maybe prune this one with you if you like. She left the cloth-covered pot behind. As Maggie reached for it, she noticed something folded beneath the leaves, a slip of paper barely visible, tucked just beneath the outer rim of soil. Hands trembling slightly, she pulled it free. A name. Mr. Ellison, Charles's old lawyer, still lives near the post office. Maggie held the note in her hand, the snow swirling gently around her, and for the first time in weeks, she sat up a little straighter. He always said if something ever happened, only trust the one who keeps stamps intact. The house was cloaked in silence. It was well past midnight, and the cold had sunk into the walls, making every floorboard creak like a whisper. The only light came from Maggie's bedroom, a muted yellow glow pooling around her rocking chair, which barely moved despite the chill. She sat with the music box on her lap. It was older than Lisa, older than most of the furniture in the house. Charles had carved it himself. During the winter he hurt his back. "Keeps my hands busy," he'd said, his breath misting in the garage air. The oak box had little compartments inside. Maggie had dusted it every week since his passing, but hadn't opened it in months, not until tonight. She ran her fingers along the grooves before lifting the lid. The soft chime played a melody too familiar, too personal. The same tune he'd hummed when planting daffodils or when folding laundry with one hand while the other held hers. Inside, neatly stacked, were envelopes, thick paper edges, yellowed, sealed with old postage stamps that bore the same emblem, a red heron mid-flight. She stared. One envelope had Charles's handwriting on the front, her name in his careful block letters. She reached for it with both hands, afraid it might disintegrate. The stamp was intact, the seal unbroken. Only trust the one who keeps stamps intact. She remembered now, his voice hoarse but calm, a few weeks before he passed. "If anything happens, go to Ellison, the one near the post office. Don't trust anyone else. Just the stamps." Her breath caught. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a smaller envelope clipped to it. The letter read, "Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm likely gone. I didn't want to burden you with my suspicions, but I've seen enough to prepare for the worst. If Brian or Teresa act strange, if they push you aside, find Ellison. He knows what to do. Trust only documents with this stamp. Burn anything else. Love, Charles." Maggie's hands trembled. Her eyes scanned the paper again and again, searching for signs she'd misunderstood. But the message was clear. He'd prepared. He'd suspected. She picked up the smaller envelope. Inside, a copy of a will dated nearly 4 years prior. The names were familiar. Brian, Lisa, herself. But Teresa's was missing. No signature from her. No mention of her. Maggie pressed her palm against the paper. Her husband hadn't intended for Teresa to control anything. A sound, the soft squeak of the hallway floorboard. She turned sharply, tucking the papers back into the music box, just as Teresa appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, holding a glass of water. Couldn't sleep. Teresa's voice was neutral, polite, but the edge was always there. "I was sorting some old things," Maggie said softly, folding the lid closed. Teresa nodded slowly. "Try not to stay up too late. It's not good for recovery." She lingered a second longer, then turned away. When the footsteps faded, Maggie whispered into the quiet, "I won't stay quiet anymore, Charles." She opened the box again, needing to check once more. But as she lifted the bottom lining, a piece of velvet Charles had glued in himself, something thin and stiff slipped out. A small drawing, pencil on brownish paper. It showed 2 hands, one small one, large, clasped together, and beneath in slanted cursive LE. Maggie stared at the drawing, the lines trembling in the light, and something deep inside her, long buried, began to stir. "I heard Grandma fell, but no one ever said why. It was early Sunday morning, and the snow had already claimed the walkway by the time Lisa arrived. She stood outside the front door, bundled in a long coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold arms full of grocery bags, and a warm smile on her face. Maggie heard the knock from upstairs, slow and deliberate. She pulled her shawl closer as she stepped into the hallway. Teresa reached the door first. "Oh, Lisa, what a surprise." Teresa said, eyebrows lifting, voice sing-song. "You should have told us." "I figured I'd just come," Lisa replied, stepping inside and stomping snow from her boots. "Brought some things, fruit tea and that cinnamon bread Grandma likes." From the top of the stairs, Maggie's heart stirred. She hadn't seen Lisa in weeks. Her voice, bright and unguarded, was like a draught of spring air in the dead of winter. Downstairs, Lisa turned to her. "Hi, Grandma," she said gently. "Can we sit a bit?" The two of them ended up at the kitchen table, Maggie cradling her favourite mug, now chipped but warm, and Lisa with a fresh cup of chamomile. The snow outside had settled into a quiet hush. The room, for once, didn't feel oppressive. They flipped through an old photo album Maggie had pulled from the closet. "That's you in the orchard," Lisa said, pointing at a black and white picture. "You look like you were about to shout something at Grandpa." "I probably was." Maggie chuckled softly. He never liked being told how to prune the trees. Lisa smiled, eyes lingering on her grandmother. "Grandma, I heard you fell." Maggie's hand paused on the photo page. "I did," she said quietly. But no one really asked how. Lisa's brows knitted. Why didn't anyone tell me? Maggie didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the album gently, pressing its spine flat with her palm. "There's something I need your help with," she said after a moment. "Do you remember the name?" "Ellison." Lisa nodded slowly. "Yeah, Dad mentioned him once. Said he used to handle Grandpa's papers." "I need to find him," Maggie whispered. "But I don't know how to use that Google thing." Lisa reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "Ellison. Let me see," she murmured, tapping quickly. "Here, Ellison and Rowe, attorneys at law. Still open. 29 minutes away in Medford." Maggie exhaled, surprised by the weight she felt lifting. "He holds something important from your grandfather." Before anything more could be said, Teresa walked in with a dish towel in her hands. "Are we digging up old papers again?" she said lightly. "No need to confuse things, Lisa." Lisa didn't flinch. "But Grandma wants to talk." "I think she should." Teresa gave a tight smile, her eyes glinting. "Just don't waste her energy, sweetie. She needs rest." Lisa looked at her grandmother again, then back at her phone. "I'll drive you, Grandma. Whenever you're ready. We deserve to know the truth." They sat a moment longer. The heater hummed gently behind them. Maggie's hand moved toward the music box, resting her fingers on the carved lid. Grandma Lisa asked, her voice quieter now. "Is it true Dad once said Ellison held the original will?" Maggie didn't blink. She simply nodded slowly, gravely, her eyes fixed on the distant snow, as if memories could step through it. And in that silence, something passed between them, not just trust, but understanding. "You remember me, Mrs. Pierce. Charles always said you never forgot a face." The fog hung low that morning, dense enough to blur the street signs and soften the corners of every building in the small downtown. Maggie sat in the passenger seat of Lisa's car, gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept much. Something about today, about stepping out of silence and into action, made her bones feel heavier, but her breath lighter. "You okay, Grandma?" Lisa asked gently as she pulled up to the curb. Maggie nodded, then whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready." "You're not doing this alone," Lisa replied, reaching over to give her hand a squeeze. "I'm right here." They stepped out into the cold. Across the street stood a small brick building, older than most around it. A faded wooden sign swung gently above the door, "Ellison and Rowe, attorneys at law." Some of the letters had peeled. The windows were streaked with condensation. Lisa pushed open the door. A bell chimed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. There were books lining the walls, thick with ribboned bookmarks. At the far end of the room, behind a heavy oak desk, sat a man with silver hair and thin spectacles perched low on his nose. He looked up. For a moment, he just stared. Then he stood slowly, his expression softening. "Mrs. Pierce?" he said. "You remember me, don't you? Charles always said you never forgot a face." Maggie stepped forward, voice quiet. "Mr. Ellison." He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit, both of you." Lisa helped Maggie settle in. Ellison leaned back, folding his hands across a worn leather folio. "It's been a long time. I was sorry to hear about Charles. He was a good man." Maggie nodded, unable to trust her voice just yet. Ellison glanced at Lisa, then back to Maggie. "I assume you're here because of the letter he left you." Maggie's eyebrows lifted. "Yes," Lisa said. "And—" she found something else. A copy of a will. Ellison opened a drawer and pulled out a file, its edges marked by time. "Charles came to me 4 years ago," he said. "He asked me to draft a new will, one that divided his estate in a more deliberate way. He wanted to ensure you'd be cared for, Mrs. Pierce, and that Lisa would have a portion set aside for her education and independence." Lisa blinked. Maggie sat perfectly still. But Ellison continued. "I never received a follow-up. No one in the family contacted me after his passing. Which surprised me." He opened the file. "This is a valid signed document. It was never revoked to my knowledge. And until a court decides otherwise, it stands as enforceable." "But—" Maggie began, voice barely above a whisper. "Then what did they use?" Ellison looked at her eyes, grave. If a different will was presented, or no will at all, then either it was created elsewhere without my knowledge, or someone neglected to disclose this version. Silence. The clock ticked above the door. Lisa leaned forward. "Can we do something?" Ellison nodded. "If Mrs. Pierce is willing to confirm her living status and current residence and formally request verification, I can file a motion to authenticate this document and initiate asset inquiry. But only if she's ready." He placed a form on the desk, sliding it gently toward Maggie. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she stared at the handwritten signature at the bottom of the will. Charles's name, neat, steady, unmistakable. "I thought I'd lost him," she said quietly. "But he planned for this." Ellison's voice softened. "He didn't forget you, Margaret. He just ran out of time." Maggie looked at the form, then at Lisa's hand resting gently on hers. She exhaled. Something inside her, timid but firm, began to rise. Everyone has something they don't want found, but the basement doesn't keep secrets. The power went out just after 9 p.m. A snap, a flicker. Then darkness settled over the house like a heavy blanket. Teresa muttered something from her room. Brian didn't stir. Maggie stood at the top of the basement stairs, a small flashlight in her hand, its beam trembling as much as her fingers. The rest of the house was quiet. Too quiet. She had waited for this moment, not the outage exactly, but the silence. A night when no one would think to watch her when Lisa had returned to college and the walls couldn't listen. The first step creaked beneath her weight. The air grew colder with every descent, the kind of cold that settled in your joints and whispered reminders of age. But Maggie pressed on. Charles had always kept things in the basement. "No one looks where it's dusty," he used to joke. She remembered the far corner under the old tarp next to the cabinet missing a handle. Her flashlight caught a stack of file boxes. Most were labelled in fading ink, taxes, bills, garden plans. But one sitting askew and nearly hidden read Charles, 2019. She knelt slowly. The lid came off with a soft pop. Inside were folders, some still bound with elastic, others torn and jumbled. Papers spilled over one another, medical files, handwritten notes, legal documents. Maggie sifted through them, heart quickening. One folder was empty, save for a ripped label. Another had papers folded too hastily, edges bent, as if someone had rifled through them. Then she found it. A property deed dated 2019, with two names typed clearly under joint ownership: Charles Pierce, Margaret Pierce. Her breath caught. She ran her fingers over the ink. He had listed her as co-owner. It was legal, binding, but it had never been mentioned. She turned the page and saw a post-it note hastily torn, the bottom half of a message ending in "Need to talk before we file." Maggie pressed the paper to her chest. A voice behind her. "What are you doing down here, Mother?" The flashlight swung in a shaky arc. Teresa stood at the top of the stairs, her silhouette outlined in the dim glow from the hallway emergency light. Maggie's mouth dried. "Just checking the old boxes? Thought I heard a drip." Teresa descended a few steps. "You shouldn't be wandering around in the dark. At your age, one fall, and you might not get up next time." Maggie folded the deed and tucked it into her coat pocket. Teresa's voice softened, but only in tone. "We all want peace, don't we?" Maggie stood slowly but steadily. "Peace comes when nothing's hidden," she said, brushing dust from her coat, "even in the dark." The two women stared at each other in the dimness breath visible in the cold basement air. As Maggie turned to climb the stairs, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "I've already stood up once. And this time, I won't fall again." Behind her, the beam of the flashlight caught a spider's web, glistening faintly undisturbed no longer. "I don't understand how you could do that to Grandma." The sun had dipped low behind the supermarket's concrete facade, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The heater hummed inside the car, a quiet whir of warmth cutting the chill of the December evening. Lisa sat in the passenger seat, arms folded, her phone silent on her lap. Teresa adjusted the rearview mirror, but didn't start the engine. They had just finished loading groceries. Or rather, Teresa had. Lisa had been quiet the whole trip. "You've been acting strange," Teresa said at last, placing her purse between them. "Is something wrong at school?" Lisa shook her head. "No, just thinking." There was a pause, a long one. Then Teresa let out a sigh, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You know," she began, voice lighter than her eyes, "your father and I had to go through so much to transfer the house deed after Charles passed. So many steps, so much red tape. Honestly, your generation has it easy." Lisa turned to look at her. "Wait, you transferred the deed to whom?" Teresa didn't flinch. "To Brian, of course. Who else?" Lisa blinked. "But wasn't Grandma listed?" Teresa hesitated. It was brief, a flicker, a breath, but Lisa saw it. The mask didn't slip, but it trembled. "She wasn't on anything official," Teresa replied too quickly. "Everything was in your grandfather's name." We had to act fast. Lisa's voice dropped. "Did you ever talk to her about it?" "She wouldn't understand," Teresa said now, watching the road, not her daughter. "She's old, emotional. These things are complicated, and she's not exactly what Lisa interrupted. Not exactly useful. Not worth considering." Teresa's mouth opened, then shut. Lisa leaned back in her seat, eyes welling but dry. "I don't want to be like you." The words hung in the air, cold, final. Teresa turned to her daughter, then expression unreadable. "You will," she said softly. "Someday, when you have a family of your own, you'll understand. You'll do what needs to be done." Lisa shook her head. "If what needs to be done is erasing people, then I hope I never understand." Neither of them spoke again. The quiet between them was deeper than silence. When they reached home, Lisa stepped out of the car first. She waited until she was alone in her room before unlocking her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, from decision. She opened the message thread with Mr. Ellison. "If you need a witness, I'm willing." She hit send. Outside her window, a light breeze shifted the branches of the frozen maple. Lisa watched them, wondering how long it took before something broke, and whether sometimes breaking was what set things right. "I don't think you need to sit at the main table, Mum. It's just a family thing." The house smelled of roasted ham and sweet potatoes. The dining room glowed with warm yellow light, and laughter floated up the hallway. Maggie stood at the threshold in a soft burgundy cardigan she hadn't worn in years. It matched the brooch Charles once gave her, small, tasteful, the shape of a snowflake. She held a wrapped book in her hand, one Brian had loved as a child, a first edition carefully kept. It had taken her half an hour to tie the ribbon just right. When she stepped in, the dining room was almost full. Brian sat at the head of the table, beaming under a modest happy birthday banner. Teresa circled with a bottle of wine, topping off glasses. Lisa caught Maggie's eye and offered a soft smile. There was no seat at the table. "Oh," Teresa said, as if just noticing. "We thought you might prefer sitting by the window, more light, less noise." She motioned to a small table near the far corner next to the patio door. A single chair, no placemat, no wineglass. Maggie hesitated. Brian didn't look up. "It's just easier this way," Teresa added, tone chipper. "The big table's a bit tight." Maggie walked to the side table and sat. The seat creaked. From where she was, she could hear every word of the conversation, but none were directed at her. The gift sat unopened on her lap. They laughed about work, about vacations, about Lisa's studies, carefully edited topics that circled Maggie like she was an old photograph on the wall. Lisa's hands clenched in her lap. Then quietly but decisively she stood. She took her plate and her glass and walked over to Maggie's table. Without a word, she pulled a second chair from the hallway and sat beside her grandmother. Teresa's voice faltered mid-sentence. Lisa looked up and said clearly, "She's the reason this family even exists. This party should have started with her." A hush fell. Maggie's eyes welled, but she blinked quickly and squeezed Lisa's hand. Brian let out a short, hollow chuckle. "Then maybe she should start handling the paperwork too," he said, almost joking, but not quite. Lisa turned to him, a flicker of confusion in her brow. "Paperwork?" she asked. He shrugged. "You know, house stuff, legal things, since she's so central to everything." Lisa watched him, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. Later that night, as the house dimmed, Lisa sat alone by her laptop. Brian's words echoed. Something wasn't right. She opened a new tab and began searching Property Transfers Oregon, Public Records Lookup. Some things don't need to be torn apart, just quietly ignored. The office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with files in faded folders, their edges curling like dried leaves. The desk lamp cast a warm amber glow across the documents spread out before Lisa. She leaned over the paperwork brows, drawn lips pressed tight. Mr. Ellison sat across from her fingers, steepled, watching without rushing. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a patient ghost. "There," Lisa said, tapping the page. "This is the 2020 file. It has 3 signatures, Grandpa, Dad, and Grandma." She pulled out a second folder, more recent. But this one, 2021 only, has Dad and Mum. Ellison adjusted his glasses, leaning closer. "Same property," Lisa continued. "Same parcel number. Same deed number. But Grandma's name just vanishes." Ellison flipped through the 2021 file slowly, his finger pausing on each signature line. "And she never signed it," Lisa added. "She told me herself." He nodded, voice low. That confirms what I suspected. If Maggie was listed on the original deed, and there's no formal removal or signature of release, then the transfer is at best incomplete. At worst, Fraud Lisa asked. He didn't flinch. It's a strong word. But yes, possibly. Lisa picked up her phone and called Maggie. The phone rang only once. Yes, sweetheart, came the soft voice on the other end. Noi, did you ever sign anything in 2021? Anything about the house? There was a pause. Then Maggie's answer came steady and calm. No, the last time I signed anything was before Charles passed. We updated everything in 2020. After that, they never asked me. Lisa met Ellison's gaze. We'll need a notary public to confirm the discrepancy, he said, and possibly a handwriting expert. If it goes to court, Maggie's testimony will be key. There was a pause on the line. Then Maggie said, I don't want the house. Lisa blinked. What I don't want, Maggie repeated. I'm not doing this to take anything. I'm doing it because they erased me. That's what hurts. Ellison smiled, faintly respectful. Then we'll proceed with the petition to validate the original will. You have every right to be seen. Lisa hesitated, then asked, if she doesn't want the assets, but she still wants the original will to be honored, is that possible? Ellison nodded. Yes. The court can recognize the will's validity without requiring her to claim the inheritance. Lisa closed the folders slowly, the weight of their contents heavier than any object. She didn't yet know what justice would look like, but now at least she knew where the lies began. I lived here for 30 years. I picked every tile myself. And now they're asking me to leave because of a missing signature. Rain tapped gently on the kitchen window, a soft rhythm against the quiet afternoon. The smell of simmering soup curled through the air, carrots, onions, thyme comforting and familiar. Maggie stirred slowly, one hand gripping the wooden spoon, the other resting on the worn counter beside her. Each groove in the wood, each nick in the tile had a story. Her story. And yet here she was, standing like a guest in what used to be her own kingdom. A knock came at the door. Lisa opened it, accepting the envelope from the mailman with a polite nod. Thank you. He tipped his cap and disappeared into the mist. Lisa turned toward Maggie, eyes narrowing as she read the return address. It's from the county clerk's office. Maggie wiped her hands on a dish towel and took the envelope with steady fingers. She didn't open it right away, just stood there breathing in the steam of the soup. Then slowly she slid a finger under the flap and pulled out the paper. Her name, her address, a formal request to appear in probate court as a named witness. She read it twice, folded it once, and placed it gently on the table. All right then, she said. Lisa looked at her hesitant. Are you scared? Maggie shook her head, stirring the pot again. I'm not scared of speaking. I'm scared of not being heard. The phone rang, sharp, brittle. Lisa picked it up and handed it to Maggie. It was Teresa. I just heard, Teresa said quickly, voice coated with a syrupy concern. Mum, you don't have to go. These things, they get messy. I mean, who wants to stand up there at your age? Just say you're not feeling well. No one will push. Maggie held the phone silently for a moment, her eyes fixed on the soup, now gently bubbling. Then she spoke calm and deliberate. For the first time, she said, I've been invited to speak. I'll be there. She hung up before Teresa could answer. The kitchen fell silent again, save for the soft clink of the wooden spoon against the pot. Maggie walked to the far counter where the tiles near the sink bore tiny knife scars, grooves etched deep by decades of chopping, slicing, cooking. Charles used to say, When it hurts too much to talk, make soup. The hands remember what the heart forgets. She placed her palm gently over the tiles, feeling the cool ceramic against her skin. She didn't know what the judge would say, but she knew every corner of that kitchen bore her fingerprints, and now her voice, like her presence, would no longer be denied. Are you sure you remember it right, at your age? The courtroom was small, wood-panelled walls. A faint chill drifted in from the hallway each time the door creaked open. Maggie sat near the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a simple grey coat around her shoulders. Across the aisle sat Brian and Teresa, both dressed impeccably, both silent. Lisa leaned over and squeezed Maggie's hand. "Ready," she whispered. Maggie nodded, her face unreadable. The judge entered his robe, brushing the floor. He took his seat and looked over the papers in front of him. "We are here today," he began, to review the validity of a contested property transfer and to determine the appropriate course of action regarding the decedent's estate. Mr. Ellison stood and motioned toward Maggie. "Mrs. Pierce is prepared to give her account." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Maggie was sworn in. She walked to the witness chair slowly, her steps deliberate. When she sat, the cushion let out a tired sigh. Mrs. Pierce Ellison began, voice calm. "Can you tell us what you recall about the signing of any documents transferring ownership of the house?" Maggie tilted her head. "I don't remember signing anything," she said softly. Teresa rolled her eyes just enough for the judge to see. "But perhaps the opposing counsel interjected. You may have forgotten. It's understandable at your age." There it was. The jab. Maggie smiled faintly. "That may be true," she said. "I forget names sometimes, or what I came into a room for. But I remember the feeling of rain on that day. It came down in soft streaks. I made chickpea soup. Charles always asked if I was tired when I cooked that soup. He never forgot." She paused, eyes scanning the room, letting the quiet hold for a moment longer. "And I remember," she continued, "that no one asked me anything that day. Not about signing papers, not about changes, not about what would happen to the home I cleaned for 3 decades. Ellison stepped forward, holding a small recorder. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to play an audio file. This recording was made in 2020 by Mr. Charles Pierce during a meeting with me." The judge nodded. Ellison pressed play. Charles's voice, warm, a little worn, filled the room. "If something ever happens to me," he said, "I want Maggie to stay in the house. That home exists because of her. She's the reason we had Sunday dinners, the reason the roof got fixed, the reason there was always something blooming in the front yard. I've signed the draft papers. Just haven't told the kids yet, they'll push back. But Maggie, she gets everything. That's my will." The room fell still. Brian looked down at the floor. Teresa's jaw tightened. Lisa sat straighter. Maggie closed her eyes for a second, letting the sound settle in her chest like a final hug. Mrs. Pierce, the judge, asked gently, "Do you have anything more to add?" She opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "I don't remember every date, every detail," she said. "But I remember who asked me how I was feeling. I remember who let me rest when I was tired. I remember who loved me and who didn't." She stood slowly, her coat catching the light from the overhead fixtures. Her face was lined but steady, the kind of strength that doesn't shout, only endures. In the silence that followed, no one questioned her memory again. "People think I wanted the house back, but all I ever wanted was my name." The courtroom had emptied slightly. A few observers had left, but the weight in the air remained dense and unmoving. Maggie sat quietly beside Lisa and Ellison, Her coat buttoned her gloves, folded on her lap. She looked straight ahead, where the judge was gathering notes. Teresa shifted in her seat, arms crossed. Brian had not spoken since the recording was played. The judge looked up. Before we adjourn, is there anything Mrs. Pierce would like to add? Any requests or clarifications to submit before the record is closed? Maggie stood slowly. A hush fell over the room. She walked toward the front, not hurriedly, not with drama, just steady. Her steps echoed gently off the old tile floor. I don't want the house, she said plainly. There was a flicker of surprise. Brian looked up. Teresa gave a short, quiet scoff, the kind that was meant to sting, not be heard. I'm not here to reclaim furniture or walls or bricks, Maggie continued. I lived those already. My hands cleaned every corner. My breath filled the winter air in that kitchen for 30 years. What I want is this. She turned slightly, her voice unwavering. My name, Margaret Pierce, to be printed in the final record, as Charles's wife, as co-owner, as someone who belonged. That's all. No one moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She didn't need to. The judge leaned forward, slightly thoughtful. That is a fair and legally sound request, Mrs. Pierce. It will be included in the revised estate statement. From beside her, Lisa let out a quiet breath, a small sob tucked into her smile. She reached for her grandmother's hand. Teresa stood abruptly and walked out, heels clicking fast, a door swinging shut behind her. Brian didn't move. He just looked at the table in front of him, as if something there might explain everything he hadn't said. Maggie turned from the bench and walked back toward the gallery. Not triumphant, just whole. Outside, the sky had softened into early dusk. The wind had picked up slightly, brushing the trees along the courthouse steps. Lisa helped Maggie down the stairs slowly. When they reached the bottom, Maggie paused. She looked out toward the street, her breath forming small clouds. Then she said quietly, I never really needed that house back, you know. Lisa looked at her puzzled. I just didn't want to be erased from my own memory of it. She smiled gently, the corners of her eyes warm, but unshed tears glistening. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like someone, not something, left behind. I used to think the kitchen held the family together. Turns out only love can do that. The morning light was filtered through heavy clouds, casting a pale grey wash across the windows. It wasn't raining yet, but the air carried that faint metallic stillness, like the sky was holding its breath. Maggie stood in the center of the kitchen. She had already packed most of her things, a few books, a shawl, the old photograph of Charles in his Sunday cardigan. Now it was the little things, the ones most people wouldn't think to take, the kind that lived in drawers and corners gathered slowly over years. Lisa crouched nearby, helping to wrap a few tea towels in brown paper. Her hands moved carefully, respectfully. Maggie reached up into the high cupboard, the one where she used to hide the good tea bags, and pulled out a tin. It was dented, faded. Inside, a few sachets remained Earl Grey peppermint chamomile. She smiled, then placed them into a small fabric pouch and tied it with twine. From the hallway above, Brian appeared. He didn't come down, just stood at the edge of the staircase, hands in his pockets, watching. Maggie didn't look up right away. She was wiping down the countertop with a damp cloth. Her movements slow, rhythmic. When she was done, she reached for the old ceramic cup, the one with the hairline crack that had been glued long ago. She held it for a moment. I don't need to keep this, she said softly, not looking at anyone. But I want to leave it where it belongs. She placed it back gently in its familiar place near the sink. Brian cleared his throat. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak. Maggie turned to him. I've forgiven you. She said, her voice quiet but firm. But I haven't forgotten. He lowered his gaze, said nothing. Lisa stood, placing the last of the towels into a box. She reached for Maggie's coat and helped her into it, tugging gently at the sleeves. They walked slowly toward the front door, shoes tapping softly against the hardwood. Maggie paused once more, looking around the kitchen, the counters, the stove, the drawer where the measuring spoons had always lived. Everything was clean, tidy, at peace. Outside, the wind stirred softly as Lisa started the car. Maggie climbed in her fingers, resting on the window switch. She looked out as the engine turned over. The house stood still. She exhaled and whispered mostly to herself, "Goodbye, Margaret Pierce at 68. Then she closed her eyes for a moment and let the kitchen go. I planted it with Charles in 1983. It still bears fruit, even though the ones who planted it are gone. The sun had returned, not warm, but soft. It was early spring, and the earth was still crusted with the chill of winter, but the air hinted at something gentler, something beginning. Maggie stood in the backyard of her new place, a modest wooden cottage tucked at the edge of town behind a fence painted the palest green. The grass was uneven, stubborn in patches, but the soil beneath was dark and alive. A small cardboard box sat at her feet, inside a young apple tree. Its roots were balled in burlap, and its slender trunk leaned slightly to the left, like it hadn't quite found its balance yet. Maggie touched the edge of the box gently, her fingers grazing the paper label, Fuji, dwarf variety, partial sun. She smiled. A breeze stirred the wind chimes by the porch. They tinkled lightly 3 notes, like the opening of an old lullaby. Behind her, the screen door creaked. "You ready?" Bar Lisa's voice was warm, carrying a kind of quiet reverence. She came down the 2 porch steps, wiping her hands on the sides of her jeans. In her other hand, a small spade. "I don't know anything about planting trees," she admitted, handing it to Maggie. "But I figured if I brought the tree, maybe you'd show me how." Maggie didn't take the spade right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky. The light was breaking through the clouds in slow ribbons, gold on grey, the kind of light that used to fall across Charles's lap when he napped on Sunday afternoons. "It's not about how much you know," Maggie said finally. "It's about where you dig." They both knelt. Lisa worked the soil, while Maggie pointed to the spot just off-center where the morning sun stretched longest. "I used to think it was about getting the tree straight," Maggie added. "But no, it's about letting the roots spread in their own way." It took a while. The ground was still hard from frost. Lisa wiped her brow. This would have been easier with gloves. Maggie chuckled softly. So would most things in life. Lisa looked at her, a smile tugging at her mouth, but didn't reply. She just kept digging. Inside the house, the kettle clicked off with a faint pop. Maggie stood slowly brushing off her knees and walked to the small patio table nearby. On it sat a brown envelope, thick official. The return address was from the county clerk's office. She had already opened it. Inside was the certified copy of Charles's will, the corrected version. Her name, Margaret Pierce, was listed plainly, as co-owner, as wife. No asterisks, no footnotes, no omissions. She had read it once already. She didn't need to again. Now she slid it back into the envelope and tucked it under a folded towel. She turned to Lisa. "How deep are we?" Lisa, half buried in dirt, looked up. "Almost there." "Good," Maggie said. "This tree will need space to breathe." She walked to the box and lifted the sapling out with care. The roots were still damp, still smelling of nursery mulch and spring. She cradled it in her arms like something fragile, but hopeful. and with the faint creak of old knees, she knelt once more beside her granddaughter. The roots settled into the earth with barely a sound. Maggie held the trunk steady, while Lisa gently filled the hole with soil, pressing it down in layers not too firm, not too loose. "There," Maggie murmured. "Let it lean a little. The wind will teach it to stand." They sat back on their heels, breathing in the cold air that carried a whisper of cut grass and something older, perhaps memory, perhaps spring. Lisa looked at her. "Do you think it'll grow?" Maggie didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on the slender branches, each one bare, trembling slightly in the breeze. Then she reached forward, touching a small nub where a leaf might sprout. "It already is," she said. Lisa smiled, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Behind them, the screen door creaked again, and a voice called from inside. "You ladies want some tea?" Mrs. Jenkins Maggie's new landlady stood at the door with two mismatched mugs. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and steady on her feet. The house belonged to her, but the kindness in her tone made it feel more like shared ground. Lisa ran up to help carry the tea. Maggie stayed in the yard, standing beside the apple tree. Her hand rested gently on its young bark. She thought of the old tree in the yard she had left behind, the one she and Charles had planted the first spring after buying that house. It had been just a stick in the ground back then, too. That tree still bore fruit, even after so many winters, even after Charles, even after her. She didn't want to go back. She didn't need to. A sound caught her ear, the soft, irregular clinking of wind chimes. The ones Lisa had hung for her last week, up near the corner of the roof. They didn't sound like the old ones. But they didn't need to. Lisa came back, handing her a warm mug. "It's just black tea," she said. "But Mrs. Jenkins swears it cures everything." Maggie took it with a quiet thank you. The steam curled up around her face, bringing warmth to her cheeks. "Do you miss him?" Lisa asked. The question floated there, simple, gentle, but full of knowing. Maggie didn't hesitate. "Every day." Lisa nodded. "Me too. Even if I didn't know him like you did." Maggie smiled her eyes, not sad, but steady. "You knew his laughter. That's enough." The sun shifted behind the clouds, and light spilled across the soil, hitting the apple tree just right. Its shadow stretched across the yard, thin but real. Maggie looked down at the base of the tree. A small wooden marker had been placed in the dirt. Lisa had carved it herself, using an old butter knife. It read, "For the ones who planted. And the ones who remember." She read it once, then again. "I think we'll be okay," Maggie said. Lisa leaned her head lightly against her shoulder. "I think we already are." They stood like that for a while, watching the wind move the branches. Then Maggie turned toward the house. Inside the window on the sill, just beside the front door, was a framed photograph, her and Charles, arm in arm, taken the summer of their 35th anniversary. His shirt was wrinkled, her hair was windblown, and both of them were laughing. It wasn't a grand photo, but it was theirs. And now it watched over a home that felt more like peace than possession. As Maggie stepped inside, the wind stirred the chimes again, soft, fleeting, and bright. The door closed gently behind her. She didn't reclaim the house, but she reclaimed her name, etched not in brick or title, but in truth. From a cold kitchen, no one sat into a garden where new roots now take hold. Maggie's quiet courage turned silence into testimony. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it leaves no doubt behind. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to disappear. Have you ever been told to stay quiet when you should have spoken up? Share your story in the comments. We read every word. And don't forget to subscribe to Heavy Stories for more tales where dignity always finds its voice.